They thought it was funny. An old man, walking slow across the hot tarmac of an Ohio airshow, jacket wrinkled, medals pinned out of order, cap pulled low. To them, it looked like a costume, like a relic trying too hard to matter in a world that had already moved on. They smirked, whispered, let their laughter carry over the roar of engines and the chatter of the crowd. But what they didn't see was the weight in his hands, the memory behind every ribbon, the names he still whispered in silence when the rest of the world had forgotten. And then everything changed. A black SUV rolled to the edge of the tarmac, the door opened, and a 4-star general stepped out. He didn't say a word. He didn't scold. He didn't perform. He simply walked to the veteran, looked at him, and raised his hand in a salute that froze the air itself. In that moment, every laugh collapsed into shame. The crowd shifted from noise to silence, and everyone understood respect is not optional. It is owed. If you believe medals are more than metal, if you believe silence can be louder than laughter, if you believe some salutes are not for ceremony but for sacrifice, then stay with us. Subscribe to Endless Stories. Share this story with someone who still carries a folded flag, and send us the names you never want forgotten. Because sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought in war zones. They're fought in memory. One salute, one lesson, one story that deserves to stand. The airshow in Dayton, Ohio had always been more carnival than ceremony. Families dragged coolers across the tarmac, folding chairs unfolded like dominoes near the fence line, and vendors shouted about hot dogs and lemonade over the drone of propellers. Somewhere in the distance, a loudspeaker announced the next demonstration. Ladies and gentlemen, please keep your eyes to the sky as the Thunderbirds prepare for takeoff. Kids squealed, parents lifted cell phones, and the sun beat down on a field of concrete that shimmered like a mirage. For most people, it was a weekend. For him, it was a reminder. The veteran walked slowly, one hand brushing the edge of his cap, the other clutching a wooden box small enough to be overlooked yet heavy enough to anchor him against the swirl of laughter and chatter. His jacket didn't match the day. Olive drab, Vietnam-era cut, zipper teeth worn smooth, elbows patched by a tailor who had never seen jungle mud. On his chest were ribbons, arranged not quite in the polished rows of a current service member, but honest enough to tell their own story. 2 bronze stars, a silver star, a purple heart that had outlived the men it should have been pinned to. The crowd barely noticed him at first. An old man wandering across the tarmac is not a headline. But the young officers did. They were gathered near the line of aircraft, 3 of them, crisp in fresh flight suits, sunglasses mirrored, boots too new to know dust. They leaned against the landing gear of an F-16 like it was a stage prop, laughing loud enough for each other, loud enough for anyone within 20 feet. "Check out Grandpa," one said, tilting his chin toward the veteran. The second smirked. "Jacket's older than my dad." The third grinned wide. "Bet he picked it up at a thrift store. Those medals? eBay special." Their laughter cut through the humid air sharper than jet fuel. The veteran didn't turn. He didn't defend himself. He kept walking, boots tapping slow echoes on the tarmac until he reached the Huey helicopter parked on static display. Green, patched, its rotor blades locked and silent. He stopped in front of it like a man stopping at a grave. He set the wooden box gently on the skid and touched the fuselage with trembling fingers. The paint was fresh, but the numbers stenciled on the side pulled him backward 50 years in an instant. The sound came first in memory. Blades chopping through wet air, radios cracked with half-sentences, a crew chief shouting over fire, then the smell oil, cordite, jungle rot, and then the names Mendez, Ward, Jackson, names not printed anywhere here, names no airshow announcer would ever say between commercial breaks. He lowered his head, whispering not to the crowd but to the machine itself. "You brought us home more times than we deserved." Behind him, the officers weren't done. "Sir," one called out mock formal. "Parade ended 30 years ago." Another laughed, elbowing his friend. "He's probably here to tell war stories no one asked for." The third raised his phone, angling it as if to snap a picture. #CosplayVet. This time heads turned. A teenager laughed nervously, unsure if it was allowed. A father frowned but said nothing. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering that not every joke deserves an echo. The veteran didn't move. His hand stayed on the Huey. His cap slid from his head and landed on the skid, brim darkened with sweat. His lips kept moving, not in anger, not in shame, but in prayer. The sun pressed down harder, baking the tarmac, blinding the crowd. The announcer's voice cracked again over the PA. "Please welcome our distinguished guest." The words were swallowed by the sudden hush of an engine shutting down, the screech of brakes near the gate, and the arrival of a black SUV rolling to a stop just beyond the flight line. The crowd stirred. Kids craned necks. The officers straightened slightly, caught between curiosity and bravado. The SUV door opened, and though no one knew exactly why yet, the air itself seemed to tighten, as if the tarmac understood before the people did that something heavier than heat was about to land. The veteran lifted his eyes from the Huey and turned slowly, the sun flashing against his metals like tired stars. The officers were still laughing, but not for long. The SUV door opened with a muted click that somehow carried louder than the roar of jets. Out stepped a tall man in full dress blues, for silver stars stitched sharp on his shoulders. His cap was tucked neatly under his arm, his walk deliberate. Not fast, not slow, but exact, as if every step had been measured for decades. General Nathaniel Briggs had arrived. The announcer's voice over the PA stumbled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Commander of Air Mobility Command." But the crowd barely heard him. The general's presence was louder than any introduction. Parents straightened. Veterans in lawn chairs shifted, standing instinctively, some out of respect, some because old habits die harder than memory. Even the kids stopped tugging at balloons and looked up, sensing in some primal way that this wasn't just another official in uniform. The general scanned the tarmac, eyes cutting across the sea of faces, then halting on the one image that didn't fit the polished frame of the airshow. An old man in a wrinkled jacket, cap resting on the skid of a Huey, hand still pressed against its skin as though he were steadying both himself and the machine. He saw the officers, 2-3 young men, frozen mid-smirk, phones half-raised, confidence draining with every click of the general's boots across the concrete. General Briggs didn't break stride. He didn't wave to the crowd or acknowledge the announcer. He walked straight toward the Huey, straight toward the man who didn't move, straight toward the scene that had tilted the balance of honor on an American tarmac. The laughter thinned, then died. It didn't fade gently, it collapsed like glass breaking under weight. The young officers shifted, their mirrored sunglasses suddenly less a shield and more a mirror to their own unease. They adjusted belts, cleared throats, as if those gestures could erase what had already been seen. The veteran finally turned. His eyes rose from the Huey's tail number to the approaching figure. Recognition flickered, not of the man, but of the bearing. He knew that walk. He'd seen it in different wars, different uniforms. A walk that said, "I carry the names too." The general stopped just 3 feet away. For a long moment he said nothing. He looked at the old jacket, the faded ribbons, the trembling hand. He looked at the wooden box resting on the skid. He looked at the eyes of a man who had already fought every battle he needed to and still carried the weight of them. Then, with no preamble, General Briggs raised his right hand. The salute snapped crisp against the hot air. It wasn't for the crowd. It wasn't for ceremony. It was for him. A salute given from the highest rank in the Air Force to a man who wore no rank now, only the weight of memory. The crowd froze. Parents hushed their kids. A veteran in a folding chair placed his hand over his heart. Even the announcer went silent, microphone still live but dead to words. The veteran blinked hard, his throat tightening. Slowly, he pulled his hand from the Huey's side, straightened his back with a quiet defiance against age, and returned the salute. His arm trembled, but his hand was steady. It rose not just for the general in front of him, but for the friends who never came home, for the nights spent pulling men out of fire, for the voices that still whispered in the dark. For one brief moment, 2 men, separated by rank, by decades, by wars, stood eye to eye on the same ground, bound by a gesture older than both of them. The salute broke. The general stepped forward, lowering his hand, and placed it gently on the veteran's shoulder. His voice carried low, but it reached the entire tarmac. "This man," he said, "wore the uniform when the world was a different place. He bled in it. He carried brothers home when no one else could. And while some of you may see an old jacket or faded medals, I see something else entirely. I see the reason you get to laugh on American soil at all." The young officers shrank under the weight of his words. One shifted uncomfortably, muttering, "Yes, sir." Though no question had been asked, the general's gaze hardened, sweeping them, pinning them. "When you mock him, you mock everyone who gave you the privilege of wearing that flight suit. You mock the silence of graves you've never stood over. And you mock the flag you swore to defend." Silence burned hotter than the sun. Then, softer, almost gentle, the general turned back to the veteran. "Welcome home, Staff Sergeant," he said, though the man hadn't been called that rank in decades. The veteran's lips parted. His answer was quiet, rough but steady. "Not everyone came home, sir." The general's jaw tightened. He nodded once. "That's why we salute." Behind them, the Huey sat silent, a monument of metal and memory. But for everyone on that tarmac, it was no longer a display, it was an altar. The crowd didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They stood in a silence heavier than any jet could break. A silence that carried shame, respect, and, just maybe, the beginning of understanding. And for the three young officers, sunglasses no longer hiding anything, shame had never felt so bright. The salute had ended, but the silence it left behind was louder than any jet engine. The tarmac seemed to hold its breath. Even the flags that had whipped restlessly in the Ohio wind stilled, as if fabric itself understood. The general kept his hand on the veteran's shoulder a moment longer, steady, grounding. Then he turned. Not toward the crowd, not toward the cameras, but toward the three young officers who had laughed. "Lieutenants," his voice rang, calm but cutting, "do you know what you were mocking?" No one answered. Their boots suddenly seemed too clean for the ground they stood on. "You weren't mocking a jacket," he continued, his tone steady as a drumbeat. "You were mocking a man who carried more than you've ever had to imagine. You mocked names he still whispers, nights he still sees, and wounds he still carries so you could wear those bars on your shoulders." The words didn't lash out. They weighed down, heavy as stone. The first officer dropped his gaze to the pavement, tracing cracks that weren't there. The second swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing like a guilty child caught in a lie. The third officer shifted his sunglasses off, sliding them into his pocket with shaking fingers, as if hiding behind mirrored glass had suddenly become unbearable. The general let the silence draw out, forcing them to feel it. Then he turned back to the crowd. Parents, veterans, teenagers with phones half-raised but frozen mid-record. What you witnessed here isn't about protocol. It isn't about medals or ribbons. It's about weight. He pointed to the Huey behind them. Its olive body gleamed in the sun, rotor blades locked in stillness. This helicopter isn't just a museum piece. Carried sons who never came back. Carried wounded whose blood stained the floor. It carried men like him, he gestured to the veteran, who chose to go back into fire when the easy choice was to stay behind cover. The crowd shifted, faces softening. A mother pulled her boy close, whispering words he'd never forget. An old Marine in the front row, ball cap shadowing his face, raised a trembling salute of his own. A teenager who had started to laugh earlier now lowered his phone, screen dark, ashamed of what he almost captured. The general's eyes scanned them all. Laughter has its place, but not here, not today. Not when a man walks onto this tarmac carrying more ghosts than you'll ever know. The veteran stood silent, eyes on the ground, as if the words weren't for him but for everyone else. He didn't need defense. He needed memory. And now he had it. One of the officers finally spoke, his voice cracking. "General, sir, we're sorry." The general's gaze softened, not forgiving yet, but leaving room for it. "Don't apologize to me," he said. "Apologize by how you lead. Apologize by how you remember. And when you wear that uniform tomorrow, wear it knowing it was handed to you by men who carried it heavier. The officer nodded, jaw tight, shame raw. The general looked back at the veteran, lowering his voice now, almost private but still carrying. Sergeant, you carried them home the only way you knew how. That's why we stand here free enough to forget. And that's why today. He lifted his chin toward the crowd. We will remember. He straightened, then saluted again. Not once, twice. The first to the veteran, the second to the Huey. And in a ripple the crowd followed. Veterans raised trembling hands. Parents placed palms over hearts. Children mimicked clumsily, saluting with awkward fingers but faces solemn. Even the announcer, choking back something in his throat, whispered into the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, please join in. Hundreds of salutes rose into the air. The young officers raised theirs too, not because they were told, but because shame had taught them what orders hadn't. Their arms locked, eyes down. Every ounce of arrogance burned away. And for the first time all day, the tarmac wasn't an airshow. It was sacred ground. The veteran's eyes lifted. And in that sea of hands he saw something he hadn't felt in years. Not parades. Not ceremonies. Not applause. Respect. Real, heavy, unshakable respect. He whispered a name under his breath. Mendez. Another Ward. He let them live again in the air, if only for a moment. The general dropped his salute, but the crowd didn't. They held it longer than protocol demands, longer than comfort allows. They held it until their arms ached, until silence was no longer empty but full. Only then, slowly, did the hands fall. The general turned to the veteran, his voice softer than before. They see you now. And though the old man's lips never formed the words, his eyes answered. It's about time. The announcer, voice trembling, finally spoke into the mic again. Ladies and gentlemen, our next demonstration will begin shortly. But please remember what you've just seen here today. Respect is not optional. It is earned and it is owed. The jets would roar. The crowds would cheer again. But nothing would erase the lesson carved into that tarmac. The day laughter turned into silence. The moment shame turned into respect. The second a salute taught more than words ever could. And for the young officers, that lesson would follow them far beyond Dayton. Into every room, every mission, every order. Because once you've seen the weight of a salute given to someone mocked, you never laugh the same way again. The crowd had begun to disperse after the salute, but the air still carried the hush of something sacred. Families wandered toward the food trucks. The announcer tried to recover his upbeat tone, and children tugged parents toward the next static display. But by the Huey, the old veteran stayed. His cap rested back on his head now, tilted low, but the wooden box still sat on the skid. The general hadn't left either. He lingered a few steps away, arms folded behind him, gaze on the box as if he knew what it carried without ever asking. Finally, the general spoke. May I? The veteran hesitated. For years, he had carried that box close but never opened it for strangers. Even family hadn't seen it. His son thought it was a cigar box. His neighbor once guessed it was for keepsakes. Neither guessed right. He nodded slowly and slid it forward across the metal skid. The general lifted the lid with the care of a man opening a folded flag. Inside lay a silver star, its ribbon faded, edges dulled by time, and beneath it a folded letter browned at the creases. No glass case, no protective velvet, just a medal and a memory, stored in wood. The general traced the air above the metal but didn't touch it. Silver star. Valor in combat. You never told anyone. The veteran shook his head. His voice came rough, like gravel dragged under boots. Some things aren't for telling. Some things are for carrying. The general's eyes softened. Tell me anyway. Not the citation. The truth. The veteran drew a long breath. His eyes went distant, away from Ohio, away from the airshow, back to a night 50 years gone. It was 1971, Cambodia border. The jungle didn't whisper. It roared, alive with insects and fear. His unit had been ordered to secure a hill that intelligence swore was empty. Intelligence was wrong. They walked straight into fire. The first burst dropped Johnson, the radio man, before he could even hit the dirt. Simmons caught shrapnel in the thigh and screamed for his mother, voice cracked and small. Riley, then Staff Sergeant Riley, through smoke, dragged Simmons behind a termite mound, and yelled for return fire. But the night lit up with muzzle flashes like fireflies in hell. They were pinned. He remembered the smell first, cordite and wet leaves, and the sound next, bullets snapping like branches breaking in the dark. Men froze. Training told them what to do, but training doesn't stop the body from knowing it's about to die. So he moved, not because he was braver, not because he wanted to be a hero, because someone had to. He crawled out, grabbed Simmons by the straps, and dragged him one-handed, rifle firing from the other. When Simmons's grip found his wrist, Riley heard the whisper, "Don't leave me, Sarge." "I won't," Riley said, though his own hands shook. He went back again, and again, for Johnson, for Torres, for men who had stopped breathing but still deserved to come home covered, not abandoned. Bullets tore bark inches from his face, but each time he dragged another man, alive or dead, back behind cover. By dawn, 3 were alive who shouldn't have been. 2 weren't. He had their dog tags in his pocket. When the bird finally came, this bird, this Huey, they loaded the wounded, the bodies, the tags. Riley climbed last, his uniform soaked with blood not his own. At the field hospital, an officer pressed the medal into his chest 3 weeks later. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action. The words didn't match the memory. The memory was hands gripping his, voices whispering names, breath rattling out. The medal went into the box. The box went into the bottom drawer of an old dresser. And that's where it stayed for half a century. Riley blinked back to the present. His hand rested on the lid of the box. "That's what it cost," he said simply. The general let out a slow breath. "And that's what they mocked." The veteran nodded once. "They didn't know. Now they do." Silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was respectful. The kind of silence you leave space for, like letting a hymn finish its echo in a church. The general closed the box, slid it back toward him. "You carried them all this time, alone." Riley gave a faint shrug. "Some promises don't expire." The general's voice hardened, not with anger but with conviction. No one should carry it alone anymore. Around them, a few people lingered. A mother holding her son's hand, a teenager still clutching an unused phone, an old Marine standing straighter than his back allowed. They had heard, maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to understand the weight inside the wooden box was more than metal. The general straightened. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "at the Memorial Park bench by the river. I'll be there. And I won't be alone." Riley studied him. His lips twitched into something that might have been the start of a smile. "All right, General. Tomorrow." The general placed his cap back on, saluted once more. Not long, not loud, just right, and stepped back toward his SUV. Riley stayed by the Huey. His hand lingered on the metal skin one last time. Then he picked up the box, tucked it under his arm, and turned into the crowd. He didn't notice the boy who followed him with his eyes. He didn't see the young officers who stood stiff, still staring at the ground. He didn't hear the announcer stumble back into cheerful routine. He just walked, steady, with nothing to prove and everything still worth carrying. The morning after the airshow broke colder than it should have for early summer in Ohio. The river carried mist that clung low to the banks, and the park's grass glistened with dew that had not yet decided to lift. A wooden bench sat facing the water, unremarkable to anyone passing by, but to Riley it was ground sacred enough to carry names. He arrived first. Old boots crunched gravel, the wooden box tucked under his arm again. He lowered himself onto the bench with the kind of care age demands, but the posture he took once seated wasn't bent. It was straight, like the spine of a man who had held the line longer than anyone asked. He opened the box, not all the way, just enough to see the edge of the metal and the fold of the letter. His thumb brushed the corner, not to polish, not to admire, but to remind. For years, this ritual had been private. Sit, whisper a name, leave. No audience. No applause. just memory, which was enough. But today wasn't private anymore. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled his eyes up. A black SUV rolled to a stop by the park gate. General Briggs stepped out, same deliberate stride as before, coat collar turned up against the morning chill. But he wasn't alone. Behind him came others. The bartender from the officers' club, still in jeans and a hoodie, carrying 2 thermoses of coffee. A librarian with a canvas bag heavy with papers. A mailman still in uniform even though it was Sunday. And then, hesitant, stiff, the 3 young officers from the Tarmac. They wore civilian clothes now, no sunglasses, no laughter. Just faces that carried something heavier than arrogance. Shame turning into resolve. The general approached the bench, stopped in front of Riley. "Morning, Sergeant." Riley nodded. "Morning, General." His eyes flicked to the others, then back. "Didn't know I invited the whole town." "You didn't," the general said. "Respect travels faster than invitations." The bartender poured 2 cups, handed one to Riley. "Black, the way you didn't finish it yesterday." He accepted it with a quiet thanks, steam rising into the cool air. The librarian set her bag down, pulled out envelopes yellowed and new. "Letters," she said softly. "From the archives. From families who wrote and never heard back. Thought maybe someone should read them." The mailman cleared his throat. "Got one of my own." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "From my father. Korea. I never knew what to do with it. Figured maybe today's the day." The 3 young officers hung back, hands in their pockets, uncertain. Finally, the one who had worn the Ranger tee at the Tarmac stepped forward. His voice was low. "We came to say we were wrong." Riley studied him. The boy's jaw was tight, eyes raw with something new. Not arrogance. Not performance. The old man nodded once. "Then don't waste it. Live right instead." The officer swallowed, nodded back. The general gestured to the bench. "May we join you?" Riley shifted slightly, enough to make room. "Names don't get lighter if I carry them alone." One by one they sat. Not all on the bench, some on the grass, some standing behind. The river carried the sound of its own remembrance, water slipping over stone. The general broke the silence first. "Ward," he said quietly, as if giving a password. "Mendez." Riley's throat tightened. He whispered them too, voice shaking. "Johnson." "Simmons." The librarian unfolded a letter, voice trembling as she read aloud. "If this reaches you, know that I'm proud. Know that I wait by the porch every evening, hoping the truck will come up the drive. If it doesn't, know that I love you. Always." She folded it again, placed it on the box. The mailman added his father's note. The bartender placed her coffee beside the wood. The young officers, unsure what to do, each spoke a single word. "Sorry." "Grateful." "Here." It wasn't polished. It wasn't scripted. But it was real. Riley looked at the metal in the box, then at the faces around him. For 50 years, remembrance had been a lonely weight. Today, it felt carried by many hands. The general rose, removed his cap, and held it to his chest. His voice was steady, low, meant for those close enough to hear. "This spot matters now, not because it's marked on a map, but because today it held the weight of names." He looked at the officers. "You'll command men soon. Remember this morning when you do. Remember that leadership isn't just about giving orders. It's about carrying silence the right way." The Ranger T nodded, jaw set with a kind of resolve no classroom had ever taught him. The river kept moving, but no one rushed to leave. They stayed, sipping coffee gone cold, listening to words read aloud, letting silence do the heavy work. When the sun finally cut through the mist, Riley closed the box and tucked it under his arm. He stood slowly, knees stiff, but his eyes clearer than they had been in years. "See you next year," he said. The general answered first. "Every year." And from the bench by the river, respect began to ripple outward, quiet, steady, unstoppable. The bench by the river became a habit. Not official, not scheduled, but every year on that same morning, people showed up. Some brought letters. Some brought flags. Some brought nothing but silence, which mattered most of all. Riley always arrived first. Box under his arm, cap pulled low. He'd sit, sip coffee, whisper names. Then the general would come, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not, but always with the same respect. The officers, now captains, returned each year too. They never laughed again the same way. They carried their own weight now, in deployments, in mistakes, in lessons learned. But time is undefeated, even against men who carried wars on their shoulders. One winter the bench sat empty. No boots on gravel. No box on the skid. Just a folded letter left on Riley's kitchen table. His handwriting steady even as his hand had grown weak. "Don't mourn me. Carry the names. That's enough." He passed quietly, no ceremony, no cameras. Just a veteran's death in a small Ohio town. Quiet, steady, like the way he lived. But when November came, the bench wasn't empty. The boy with the camera, now taller, older, but still carrying the same Polaroid, came first. He set the wooden box, entrusted to him by Riley's neighbor, on the bench. He opened it, looked at the metal and whispered, "Ward, Mendez, Johnson, Simmons." Then came the general. His hair thinner, his stride slower, but his salute just as sharp. He placed his cap over his heart and said, "Riley." For once, he let the name out loud. The officers followed, no longer boys. They placed their unit patches on the bench, each one stitched tighter because of what Riley had taught them. One of them whispered, "We carry them forward, Sarge. We promise." And then came others. The bartender with 2 coffees, one set untouched. The librarian with more letters. The mailman with new envelopes from families still waiting for closure. Mothers, fathers, children, veterans in wheelchairs, teenagers who had only seen the story online. By noon, the grass around the bench was filled. Not loud, not performative, just present. The mayor arrived last. No podium, no speech. She simply placed a plaque behind the bench. "This spot matters. Here we remember not just one man, but all who carried names the world forgot." The crowd didn't cheer. They saluted. Hundreds of hands rose, some trembling with age, some awkward with youth, but all sincere. The silence that followed was heavier than grief and lighter than shame. It was legacy. The boy with the camera took one picture. Not of faces, not of medals, but of the folded flag resting on the bench, sunlight breaking through mist behind it. He posted it that night with a single word. Still. By morning, thousands had shared it. Not with emojis, not with hashtags, with names. Each comment a whisper. Fathers, brothers, daughters, friends. A digital wall of memory, built not in stone but in voices. The general saw it and nodded. "Good," he said. "Let them speak. Because silence doesn't have to mean forgetting. Sometimes it means carrying together." And so, even though Riley was gone, he wasn't. His medal stayed in the box. His name stayed on the bench. His story stayed alive every time someone lowered their voice and raised their hand. The officers who once mocked him now taught cadets that respect is not optional. The boy with the camera grew into a man who told stories so others would not fade. The general carried needles in his pocket, stitching patches for younger soldiers, teaching that small acts hold the heaviest weight. And each November the bench filled again. Not with applause, not with noise, with remembrance. Because one salute on a tarmac had turned laughter into shame. And shame, when faced, had turned into respect. And respect, when carried, had become a legacy. The wooden box never left the bench again. Anyone who came could open it, see the medal, whisper a name, and add their own weight to the silence. Somewhere Riley was at peace. Not because he had been remembered, but because the names he carried no longer rested on his shoulders alone. And so the story closes where it began. Not with laughter, not with shame, but with a salute. One man's salute to another. One nation's salute to all. The last salute given. The lasting legacy kept. We don't honor veterans because of medals on their chest or uniforms on their shoulders. We honor them because they carried names when the world stopped asking, because they walked back into fire when the easy choice was to stay behind cover, because their silence weighs more than any words. On that Ohio tarmac, laughter died when a general saluted an old soldier. At the river bench, remembrance grew from one man into a community. And now, through stories like this, the legacy keeps moving. Name by name, fold by fold, salute by salute. If the story touched you, do something simple but lasting. Subscribe to endless stories so voices like Riley's are never forgotten. Share the story with someone who still keeps a folded flag close. Say a name out loud, a father, a brother, a friend. Keep them present. Carry respect. In your words, your silence, your leadership, because respect isn't optional. It is owed. One salute turned laughter into shame. One community turned silence into legacy. Now it's our turn to carry it forward.